Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video, and today we are going over everything you need to know to get ready for Season 3 as a Shadow Priest. Now, I say getting ready, I don't intend on this being like a full-fledged guide, although I'll go over quite a lot. And the reason for that is, I think things will probably change a little bit. I do want to make sure you're prepped, but, who knows? We might see some changes that could adjust talent builds, rotation even, stuff like that. It's not out of the question, although, we'll see what actually happens. So this guide is kind of meant as what's the current state of playing Shadow in Season 3. If you're looking for the most up-to-date information, if you're watching this, even a week or so after the patch launch, make sure you check out the description or any pinned comments that I have to see if there have been any changes. I'll always keep the Icy Veins guide fully up to date as like a written guide, and then if things do change substantially, I'll probably re-record a full-fledged guide, kind of depending on how things shake up. But otherwise, we're going to cover changes, talent builds, all the usual stuff. So let's dive in. All right, so the first thing that we're going to cover with the new patch is kind of what's changing. Now, I won't lie to you, Shadow has kind of gotten some weird changes that have made it a little not quite ideal from what I was looking for, but we'll go over them nonetheless. So the biggest ones actually happened from like the class perspective. So the big ones, Power Infusion was nerfed. Still a 2-minute cooldown, but it now only lasts 15 seconds instead of 20. And only gives 20% haste instead of 25. So this is kind of like a double whammy. It does also nerf the Power Infusion we're giving others and our own Power Infusion. So that is kind of unfortunate. And then also the other big one that happened is Mass Dispel was changed to be a baseline 2-minute cooldown. And there's no way to reduce it unless you take the PvP talent, which reduces it to a 1-minute cooldown. So from a PvE perspective, you're locked into a 2-minute. The improved Mass Dispel talent was changed to be Mental Agility, which just reduces mana costs of our dispels. And honestly, this is kind of a dead talent as Shadow. I think with the mana rework that happened, a few patches ago, we haven't had mana problems for the most part. So I doubt this will see much use, at least in the current state. So yeah, those are the big ones. From like a class perspective. And they also did a few spec changes, I'll note. So Shadow or Death is a shared spell, but, from a Shadow Priest perspective, they did change how the backlash damage works on Shadow or Death. It used to be directly proportional to how much damage it dealt, which was always kind of problematic, especially in, old world content or something, where you could like really, really hurt your character. They changed it to be a static percent health, so now it's just baseline, it deals 8% of your max health, and then Tide Evasion reduces that further. So, down here, deals 50% left. So, the nice part about that is, and we'll get to that in a second, we have our new tier set going into the patch, which is kind of revolving around Shadow or Death. But even though we're pressing Shadow or Death with higher priority more often, we're actually not ended up taking that much more damage from live. So it's pretty comparable. So it's actually, if you take the existing rotation, add all the Shadow or Death changes, you're generally taking less damage. And then if you factor in the tier set, it's pretty even, I think, to what we had before. So, but it still can chunk. As far as other changes to go out with the spec, so Shadow Crash was changed to deal reduced damage beyond 5 targets. Again, because the tier set is buffing it, so they wanted to make sure it wasn't scaling out of control. And then the other big changes was Surge of Insanity. So this is our empowered fillers, Mind Flay Insanity or Mind Spike Insanity. On live, we used to get a stack of this for every single Devouring Plague cast. On 10.2, it's now every other cast. So every other Devouring Plague will enhance your next filler. This is a pretty substantial nerf, just looking at it by itself. We cast these quite a lot. I think they were a little concerned about things being too busy or like capping charges, that kind of thing. So this change has led to a few knock-on effects or dominoed effects. One, it does, we're not as concerned with like, pressing Devouring Plague too often anymore. So Mind's Eye looks a little better, that kind of stuff. As well as like, we're not relying on these spells as much as we were before. To compensate, they did buff Mind Flay Insanity, and Mind Spike Insanity. Notably, they didn't touch Mind Spike. So you actually do see going into next patch, you'll probably see more Mind Flay builds than we did before. And there's a couple reasons for that. This is one of them. Also, we're losing our current tier set, which was kind of Mind Blasty focus with Shadowy Insight, which does kind of make Mind Melt less valuable. And again, just kind of as we scaled up, the other talent points are doing well as well. So for anyone that was looking to play Flay, it is, you know, neck and neck with Mind Spike on movement, single target, you know, pure no movement patchworky stuff. Mind Spike's like less than 1% better than Flay, but still much closer than it was in the past. And I think you'll probably also see Flay more often inside of dungeons, especially if you're not even taking Dark Ascension. So just some notes on kind of what's changed. So okay, so let's dive into the builds that you need for Season 3 as a Shadow Priest. Okay, so in this section of the video, I'm going to go over just kind of the base talent builds that you need for Shadow Priest in Season 3 from a PvE perspective. Now, the caveats I'll make here is there are options with almost every single one of these builds. If you want the details on like what you can swap out depending on your preference or what you want to specialize in, check out the links in the description or the IC Vans guide. Okay, so starting off with single target, very similar to what we were running on live if you were already playing Dark Ascension, almost exactly the same, if not what you were playing before. The main difference is I think before you could kind of choose to use Death Speaker or not, but now with the new tier set, you definitely want to play Death Speaker, and even before tier set, I would suggest Death Speaker from even just a movement or a proc perspective. So yeah, this is going to be your default single target talent setup. You do have an option here to run Mind Flay instead of Mind Spike if you really want. Again, like I said, pure turret single target Spike will do better. Flay just becomes even with Spike as you add movement with all the changes to Flay. If you do want to do that, all you're simply doing is dropping Mind Melt and Mind Spike to take Void Touched and Dark Evangelism capped out instead. So yeah, either one of those guys are fine. I will probably be playing Spike as a default, at least inside of Raid, but you know, Flay's always there if you need it. Again, pretty standard if you've played it before, no real changes. I am taking Psychic Link here. Note that obviously if it's pure single target, you don't need to pick that. You can, you know, move that to Silence if you want or whatever else. Now, the build that we'll probably be running most often in Raid is actually just a slight adjustment from that, but now with Shadow Crash. So all we do is simply we're swapping maddening touch points out for Shadow Crash, and then typically with ads we get a bit more value out of Mind Devourer when you're spreading with Distorted Reality. So yeah, I say you're going to run this most often because there are just so many fights that are, you know, mostly bosses with ads coming in, and this is your base, your go-to here. No real big changes here. I will note some of the class tree stuff, you know, might be a little outdated, or you might want to change it up on the boss. Like I said, probably not taking mental agility. You can kind of move that around, kind of whatever you want. Halo Divine Star, again, still mostly preference, although Divine Star will give you a more comfortable opener if it's something you can, you know, you have a long time before pull. Okay, so from a raid perspective, that's going to cover almost every boss. The exception is there is a 3-target council boss in the raid. So with that, I would suggest altering a little bit, and mostly it's just to pick up Idol of N'Zoth, and then we swap over to Screams of the Void. There are some kind of, you know, again, you do have some options here depending on how much you want, like where you want to optimize your damage. It's kind of a weird fight. It's like a 3-target boss, but only 2 of those bosses are usually stacked at a time, although you can sometimes get lucky and have all 3 stacked. So this build is optimized for the 2 stacked 1 spread scenario. As you get more stacked, you'll see a bit more emphasis on N'Zoth. But even with the spread, N'Zoth is still doing pretty well. So this is like what I would start with. The kind of options here is that, you know, spreading Devouring Plague might be a little hard for some people, or might feel overwhelming on this fight. If you don't want to do that, you by no means have to. You can definitely, you know, go Mind's Eye if you really want to kind of funnel in on one specific target. So that is kind of an option if you prefer, although again, the bosses do all need to die at the same time, so you got to be kind of careful. When I was doing the boss over testing, I was kind of moving Plague around to whatever priority target I needed and trying to spread as I could. You can take Mind Devourer here if you really want. Kind of depends. I mean, I've seen some kind of pretty even spread. I like Mind Devourer with Distorted Reality. Kind of depends on how much you feel like you can spread Devouring Plague comfortably. It can be kind of a lot going on with a fight. And the other option is you could swap these points out of Screams into Mastermind instead. This is basically, do you want more priority target damage, or do you want more overall damage if you take Screams? Mastermind is generally better on that single target. And same thing, if you prefer Mind Flay, you can also do that. It's a bit closer here. But again, kind of whatever you're kind of looking for. So yeah, that's a 3-target build. Definitely a bit more options than the other raid fights. And I think you'll see kind of a lot of diversity here. You might even see a lot of people just running the single target Shadow Crash build on that fight. And just kind of foregoing N'Zoth, which is kind of RNG. So I could see a lot of people on Prog just dropping N'Zoth completely just to get more priority target damage. So you might see that as well. So we'll see what people end up wanting to build into. So that should pretty much cover you from a raid perspective. And then for dungeons, I have 2 kind of prepared builds that we'll go over. Again, same thing here. You have some options. So first off, there's kind of 3 main dungeon builds as a base. There is the single target plus Shadow Crash build we saw before. So if you're looking for like, I need maximized boss damage, but I don't want to be completely useless on AoE, this is what you want to go for. You just pick up Shadow Crash and then you're good. For most dungeons, though, I would suggest running N'Zoth just for that extra bit of AoE and overall damage. Again, kind of tailor that to what you like. And I would generally suggest you lean towards using Mind Flay. I think as you see, things go up, Mind Flay's value has gone up. Dark Evangelism looks nice. So yeah, I think Distorted Reality, I think builds you could still play Spike if you want. But yeah, I would generally say lean towards Flay, but both are still viable. Again, this is very similar to I think what you saw on the 3-target council boss. And again, you have some options here, right? You can run Mastermind if you want more single target. You can run Screams if you want more AoE. Like I said, Flay or Spike still an option. And then Distorted Reality or Mind's Eye. These are both still competitive choices. Do you want 1% more priority target damage in AoE? You can pick Mind Flay or Mind's Eye. Sorry. If you want more kind of overall and kind of the ability to kind of spread Devouring Plagues and use that playstyle, you can play Distorted Reality. The real change here is if you run Distorted Reality, would highly suggest running Mind Devourer. If you decide you like Mind's Eye and that kind of playstyle better, you just drop those points in Mind Devourer and put them into Maddening Touch, and that's it. And you can kind of like play off of that. If you're kind of running this like Mind's Eye, I cast a lot of dots build. I also like running Screams with that too. It just kind of all plays together. So there's, and like I said, there's 2 versions of this. There's the Dark Ascension version, or you can just run it with Void Form. Void Form, I like a little bit more of like the dot style and Screams of the Void playstyle with Void Form. With Mind's Eye, getting that extension on Void Form, all that good stuff, it plays nicely. So I think you'll see Void Eruption lean more towards always using Flay, leaning towards Mind's Eye for that kind of funnel playstyle, as well as kind of buffing more dots and Screams type stuff. Although the base of the build is still running Idol of Yasharaj, Cthulhu, and N'Zoth. So yeah, I think if you're kind of looking for more like a punchier build that does, more base damage and not relying so much on dots, that's where it's like, okay, Dark Ascension, Destroyed Reality, Mastermind with N'Zoth, as kind of like a foundational build, especially for low to mid keys. This is like where I would suggest you start. And then as you get into higher keys, when you're just pulling several packs together or even pulling things on top of the boss, then you can start considering running the kind of Void Eruption, more dot focused version of this. And again, you can still run Distorted Reality if you really want, although I think usually I'd suggest this setup for Void Form. Now you got to be careful because Void Form is more of a loss in single target than it has been in previous patches. Dark Ascension just has so much synergy with our new tier set and all that stuff. Void Eruption is considerably behind with this build specifically. So I would very much caution using this unless you really feel confident in what you're doing and you know that you're chain pulling a lot or pulling a lot on top of the boss, especially on like tyrannical weeks. Especially, you're losing 7-8% single target damage. That can really lower your overall damage when so much of the key is focused on boss. So those are the kind of 2 bases. Like I said, there's quite a lot of like small choices with this build: Mind Spike, Flay, Destroyed Reality, Mind's Eye, Void Eruption, Dark Ascension, Screams, Mastermind. So you can kind of play around with it and kind of feel what works best for you. But those are the bases. And again, in the description and Icy Veins specifically, I've gone over kind of each of those choices in depth to kind of build what makes the most sense for your group, your key, and what you want to build into. But those should be the bases, and hopefully that helps out when you're choosing your talents. Okay, let's talk about rotation briefly. I've gone in depth kind of a couple times, and if you want the kind of full in-depth rotation, Icy Veins is the best way to consume that. And I'll give kind of an example of like the opener on the screen behind me. For the most part, things are very similar to what they were in the previous patch if you played Shadow. If you haven't, let me kind of break this down in terms of rotational goals. So if you kind of follow these goals in order, you're generally going to be fine for whatever content you're doing. So number one, your first priority is maintaining Shadowed Pain and Vampiric Touch on roughly up to 12 targets. And you can absolutely use Shadow Crash to help with this, specifically with Whispering Shadows. Should cover you with 8. I would never go over like 12 as like the rough number, so like 4 manual, 8 Shadow Crash and AoE, but this is your top priority, is maintaining those 2 dots. And then also maintaining Devouring Plague. So this is your second goal, is making sure that you have as much uptime on the Devouring Plague dot on your target as possible. So what this means is you want to kind of delay pressing Devouring Plague until the dot is about to expire, or you're about to cap on Insanity. The kind of other part with this is if you're using Destroyed Reality, you can choose to spread Devouring Plague without really hurting this uptime problem. If you're using Mind's Eye, you want to funnel on one target. You don't have enough Insanity generation to be spreading it and getting the value, so you just want to funnel. When you cast Devouring Plague and it already is on the target, it does add its damage to that next dot, so you don't have to worry about that. But we're mostly doing this to maintain uptime of our mastery to get that bonus more often, and also keep in mind things like Insidious Ire, which also play into that. Okay, your next goal, rotational goal, is to use your short cooldown spells to make sure you're using them as often as possible. So with this, the idea here is, you don't want to lose uses of these guys because they're so short on cooldowns. You want to kind of put these on cooldown first before pressing any of the longer stuff. So what this usually looks like from a priority perspective going into 10-2, Shadow or Death is going to be basically the top of this list, then Mind Blast and stuff like Void Bolt, all that kind of stuff. If you want the exact priority, check the description below. Just know that the major change going into this patch is that Shadow or Death is now your highest of those guys when you get the new tier set activated online. The next goal is to then use all the long cooldown spells. So this is mostly things like Void Torrent or even Mind Games, depending on the setup. So again, use those after you put all your short stuff on cooldown. If you want to kind of further optimize this, the thing to keep in mind as well with charge spells, specifically Mind Blast, is you can only cool down that one charge at a time. So once you've put one charge of Mind Blast on cooldown, that's your kind of chance to weave in all this other stuff without losing uses of Mind Blast itself. So there's a bit of optimization there of saying, okay, I can afford to use like a longer cooldown spell because I have one charge of Blast already ticking, and I can use the second charge when I've done everything else. And then the final point is really use your big cooldowns on cooldown. So if you're using Void Eruption, Dark Ascension, Mindbender, you want to use those as close to on cooldown as you possibly can. The trick here is kind of based on the fight time and what you're doing. So from a rotation perspective, it's really important to understand how long whatever it is that you are expecting the things to last. Get a time to death tracker, something like that, where you can clearly see, yep, this is a 5-minute boss, and you can kind of roughly plan when you want to use your cooldowns, or maybe holding your cooldowns to get optimal uses, to try to sync things like your combat potion, which is on the 5-minute timer, or to sync up with Twist of Fate uptime when the target will be inside of execute. The other big thing to know for dungeons is to make sure that you have the cooldowns when you want them. You don't just want to like slam your cooldowns on the pack right before the boss if it's tyrannical, especially if you're going to use Lust on that boss. So make sure you're coordinating with those kind of efforts. But once you can handle that, the rest should hopefully fall into line. And if you want the kind of min-max details, check out the links below. But if you can accomplish those goals well, that's fundamentally Shadow Priest in a nutshell. It's really not hard at that kind of base level, although there are some intricacies on how you want to weave stuff in. So hopefully that helps. Okay, next up, let's kind of briefly cover your prep work, your consumables, all the stuff that you need to bring to a raid or a dungeon to make sure that your character is ready. So first up, we'll cover enchants. I'll try to put up the graphics from the guide below just to make this a little easier to see. So for your helm enchant, there's a new one this patch called Incandescent Essence. It's going to kind of scale as we go throughout the patch and the expansion. Make sure you're using that when it's available. For your weapon, similar before, use Sophic Devotion or Wafting Devotion. It kind of depends on the scenario, but I have seen Wafting looking better and better. So, you can always check that with your character, send that yourself to see what you might want to use, but should be a competitive option for folks. Leg enchant, frozen spell thread still kind of go to, although lambent armor kit is still good as well. So it depends on if you want more verse, more stam. I think kind of a toss up for me. Chest enchant, waking stats still the go to. Ring enchants. Okay, so this is where things get complicated, and this logic is going to be similar for gems, food, and runes and other things too. Going into this patch, we were already kind of at optimal haste and mastery levels, and we're just getting more secondary stats going into 10.2. So stats are going to be a little more complicated, I think, for a lot of players than they're used to. Haste and mastery are still our best 2 stats. Our stat priority is almost unchanged. It's still mastery, haste, basically dead even, then crit, then verse. Now, with this, you need to keep in mind the diminishing return thresholds for stats. If you're not familiar with that, basically, the game punishes you for stacking too much of a single stat by reducing enough of it over thresholds. So what that means is, if you have more than 30% of haste, for example, every point above that is actually reduced. And there's like increasing thresholds. So you don't want to overly stack a stat unless that stat is significantly better than other things. So what this means for Shadow Priest in this patch, you kind of have stat goals here that determine what you want to use for things like enchants, runes, that kind of thing. Because of these thresholds and these runes are kind of small amount, when you're talking about like a ring enchant or a rune, applying a 10% reduced effect on it because of a threshold, our stats aren't that far apart from each other, even though we have that kind of loose priority. So you want to adjust your enchants and runes and that kind of thing to take full advantage of that system. So what this means, below 35% haste, you want to kind of prefer haste enchants. Below 19 to 20% mastery, use mastery enchants. If you're at or above both of those kind of soft thresholds, that's when you want to start consider using critical strike or versatility enchants. And this logic is going to apply for, like I said, runes, food, and everything as well. So you're going to see a lot of people using crit and verse enchants, runes, and gems because they've already hit those kind of first thresholds of the DR. Just to know, our DR for mastery starts at 19% because of the way the calculation works. All the other stats start at 30%. So yeah, those thresholds, roughly 30-35% haste. That's kind of your go-to sweet spot. Mastery is like 19 to 21%. Anything over that, you probably should consider moving stuff into crit and verse, at least at like an enchant gem level. Now, if we take the same thing for runes, there are 3 runes to consider. There's the Howling rune, Hissing, or Buzzing. For most players, you can start out with using Howling. If once you get above too much haste, you can move on to Hissing. Once you get above too much mastery as well, then you can move on to the Buzzing rune, and that's kind of your order of operations. So gems is going to be the same kind of thing. There are a lot of gems here. I'll put the list over. There's kind of a lot of options here depending on what stat is DR'd where. This is, again, kind of more of a min-maxy thing. So if you don't like this, you can feel free to kind of ignore and just saga what you want. But if you're listening to this, you're probably wanting to min-max because this video is super long. Sorry about that. So yeah, you kind of want to play with your stats a bit more this patch to make sure you're not reducing the value of things like gems and enchants. And then finally, for our consumables, our food specifically, similar things are happening. Because of the way that everything has scaled, we're actually seeing a much lessened value for intellect food and feasts specifically. So going into this patch, I would strongly consider picking up non-feast food to use as your default. And again, these guys, similar to everything else, are susceptible to the diminishing return thresholds. So depending on your stats, you're going to want different food. If you're starting out sizzling seafood mentally all the way over, if you're DRing everything, use your Revenge Serve Cold. So yeah, you have quite a lot of options here, but I would generally suggest using these over Feast, which is the important change going into this patch. Feast just isn't scaling as much. It's possible they might buff it, but as of now they haven't, so this is going to be our new default. And then, like we already mentioned, for gems and for stats, all this kind of stuff, again, your goal, keep mastery and haste roughly equal, and then go critical strike, then go versatility. Okay, So that's stats. I know it's pretty complicated, and like I said, the written guide goes into detail of like what to choose where. If you want the specific item names, you can always refer back to that. Okay, let's talk about gearing your character going into the patch. So the first thing I want to cover is embellished items. There was quite a lot of changes going into 10.2 that will kind of adjust what you want to pick. And this is your kind of rough priority list going into the next season. So first things first, Sport Cloak was updated. They did reduce how much the shield is actually giving, but they did add static verse while above 70% health. If you take this combined with the defensive value, this is clearly our best in slot option, and I highly suggest 100% of people use this all of the time for maximizing damage and defensive value. It's just that good. So this is your best option by a long shot. And then the second thing that you use is very much up in the air. They nerfed and changed quite a lot of these guys. So it's going to be kind of depending on like your preference and how you want to optimize your character. Now, what I would suggest for a lot of people is to strongly consider the allied risk cards of time dilation for kind of single target damage, especially. Still good in dungeons. We'll get to dungeons in a second, but for raiding, this is my optimal second choice for most people. The reason for that is, as you can see here, it's basically just a verse proc for you and your 4 closest allies. Now this is really important because it is giving you kind of raid DPS benefit, which is why I suggest it for most people. If you're talking about like a raid and progression, giving that raid wide benefit is very strong. And if you factor in that raid wide benefit, this thing is clearly performing very strong. It's not crazy strong or like super ahead of everything by any means, but I think the raid DPS alone factors in quite a lot. The caveat here is obviously if this is buffing, a healer or a tank, it's not giving them, obviously you're not getting the kind of damage value from that. So there's some caveats here. But it isn't kind of in a slot that we don't care too much about, meaning risk. So we do take a little bit of an eye level hit from Bisque here on that. But because it's risk, it's not that big of a deal. And the other cool part of it is it can stack. So if you have multiple people in the raid using this item, and there is one for every single armor type, you can overlap these buffs, get multiple procs at once, which can also just add more raid DPS. So I think if you factor in that and kind of if you get more of your raid to use it, especially the cloth members, I think will have the easiest time. This is my second choice for embellishments for that reason. So obviously if you're looking to min-max just your own personal DPS, maybe it's not for you, but would strongly consider this as a good crafted option for your embellished items. Next up is the Hood of Surging Time. This is the kind of dungeon option. With all the other changes that have happened with embellishments, we're seeing pretty good value out of this from a dungeon perspective. Obviously, this thing kind of is bad, pure single target, so take that with a grain of salt. But you did get quite a lot of benefit from a trash perspective, getting this buff at the start of every single pack, which is pretty huge. And again, a lot of bosses in dungeons also have ads and stuff that can proc this, and we do see pretty good value out of it. Now, this does mean you can't use tier Helm if you're using this. So early on in the season might be kind of awkward depending on what tier that you get that drops and your catalyst charges. But this is something I would definitely look at using kind of medium to long term. Now, the other options, again, pretty much come down to preference. They all have some notable downsides. So it's basically you're picking the best of the options that have issues or downsides, and it's really kind of a personal thing. So my advice, you kind of want to live in this like these top 3 as the ballpark, and then focus after that on just the biggest upgrade that you can craft. If you're looking to min-max, some of these options might make more sense to you personally over maybe the risk cards or the hood. Again, I think Sport Cloak is the default. To cover these a little bit, Blue Silken Lining. This one's always been a little difficult because it's so dependent on when you actually have it active. You only get the effective of 90% health. So if you're looking like raid wide, especially with a boss with heavy damage going out, it can be really hard to get good uptime of this. Like even 30%, 40% is typical. So because of that, it's pretty low priority. The reason why it's still on this list and why I put it at number 4 is simply because we do more healing during our cooldowns, which is when we want this mastery benefit. So typically you are more healthy during your cooldowns, which is where you're getting the majority of your damage out, which is why you'll still see generally good value out of using this, even though the health threshold is a little aggressive. Again, keep in mind we do cast Shadow Death a bit more now, so if the raid has a lot of damage going out during your cooldowns, like Rashok was a good example. I think you were frequently using cooldowns when you're just taking a lot of damage anyways. Blue Silken Lining will struggle a lot. So that's why it's not like a clear choice. If you had 100% uptime at Blue Silken Lining, it would be our best by far, but that's just not realistic, which is why it's kind of meh for most people. I would prefer to use the Allied Risk Guards or something else. So moving on to Shadow Flame Tempered Armor patch at number 5. This guy got nerfed going into the patch in terms of how much damage it's doing, and then they also buffed how much damage you personally take when it procs. Because of that, and again, it is just kind of a pure single target thing. It's still okay in pure single target. So if you're only raid focused, maybe it makes sense for you. But again, the kind of downside of taking more damage, I don't know, not my favorite combination. Again, roughly equivalent to Blue Silken Lining at average of 50% uptime in pure single target. Still okay there, but there is a lot of non-single target even in the raid. And if you care about Mythic Plus, I don't think this makes sense to craft. Next up is Elemental Lariat. This guy is kind of weird. At full sockets, it's roughly equal to Blue Silken Lining at 30% uptime, which is pretty horrible in general. But again, it's a bit more controllable in that sense. It's not quite as, Feast or Famine necessarily. It still is doing something, and it's a good neck to craft if you're struggling to get a neck. But again, you get the most value out of this when you have full sockets. So it's not really like an early or mid-season craft. Maybe at the end of the season in Mythic Plus, you don't like Blue Silken Lining, you don't like Hood, you don't like Risk Cards, then consider Lariat. That's kind of where this is at. All of these other options are pretty poor performers. I wanted to list them here just to show you kind of the changes that they made going into the patch. But the Azure Weave set, the Chrono Weave set, and the 2 new embellishments they added this patch are generally not worth using. And I think everything else would be a better fit from an embellish perspective. And then make sure you're using your flavor pocket. So that's embellishments. Again, if you want more detail, I have sections on all of it already. But let's kind of move on to the next bit of our gearing, which is trinkets. So again, trinkets, they've also changed quite a bit. This is kind of what we're looking at. There's kind of a wide range of things here depending on what you want. And it's actually very similar about kind of what downside are you comfortable using when it comes to trinkets. Because there's not going to be like, oh, you always use these 2 trinkets anymore. It's going to be there's more of a choice involved here. When it comes to trinkets, these are my rough rankings for raiding and for dungeons. So let's talk about them briefly. Top one is Bellerosa Suncolor. This is just a straight up damage trinket on a 2-minute cooldown with flat int. It does a lot of damage, even on pure single target. The only trick is it has a 10-yard range, so you need to be in melee to use it. Because of this, it might be awkward on certain fights where that's just not possible because the ranged need to be in range, they're baiting, whatever else it is. So this will not be a good trinket to use on every single boss in the raid or even certain dungeon environments. But if you can make it work, you should use the trinket. It's that good. So that's why it's number 1 slot in both cases. Now, next up, we'll cover raiding first is Balefire Branch. Again, it's a pretty good on-use trinket. We use it on a 2-minute cadence with Power Infusion, and it just gives us big int. Now, the caveat here is it decays faster when you're taking damage. It doesn't factor in if you have like absorbs on you. So like if you're using Balefire in the opener, you should press Power Word Shield before you start to make sure you keep Balefire active as long as possible. And I've seen like on openers of raid testing, the trinket only lasts 16 seconds where it's fully 20 seconds just based off damage taken. So in a case where you're not taking too much damage during cooldowns, this thing is our kind of second best next to Belleros. But again, that's a pretty big caveat. There are some fights where you are just taking lots of damage during your cooldowns. Again, similar to when we were talking about Blue Silken Lining. So it can be okay, but again, depending on how much damage you're taking, you're going to see a wide range with this trinket. So keep that in mind. Next up is the passive trinket, the Friendship Badge. Just kind of a nice set it and forget it passive secondary stat trinket. We're not too worried about DRing some of these effects because, it doesn't give us haste, although we might still DR the Mastery proc, which is something to keep in mind. This is just a good all-around trinket. I suspect it's going to be very popular from most specs in the game, but it is going to be kind of a nice go-to slot for us. if you can get it. Next up from a rating perspective is Naimu's Unraveling Spindle. This one has gone through quite a lot of changes, quite a lot of iteration, and it does have some notable downsides. So just at its base value, if you're getting full uptime, perfect uses of Belros and Balefire, it's just worse. Just categorically, it's just worse in 99% of cases. Obviously, like I said, though, both of these trinkets have notable downsides, which does mean Naimu's might still be a good choice for you because it is more consistent in that regard. Now, you do have to sit there and channel this for 3 seconds. You cannot move during the channel, so if there's a fight that is heavy movement before your cooldowns, you're going to struggle to get this guy off. It can also be kind of awkward timings on fights like Gnarl Root, things like that. But if you can get it, it does pretty well. So it does have some downsides, although again, they're not the same as the other guys. So use what makes sense for you. Now, I will note that you can see at the bottom here, it says damage increased by 50% against immobilized targets. So this does count stationary targets like a training dummy, for example. So if you just use it on a training dummy, you get the increased damage. That similarly applies if it's like a Mythic Plus mob and it's stunned or something like that. Now, in Raid, the reason why I bring this up is there are 2 bosses that automatically benefit from this 100% of the time, which is Volcaros and Naimu herself. So on those 2 bosses specifically, you actually get pretty good value out of this trinket. So if you do have it for those bosses, I would strongly consider using it. Generally speaking, it works well on those fights as well. So yeah, it's a good trinket to have in your back pocket, although maybe not something you use all the time. And then if all of those cases don't work, then you use Sea Star. It's just a nice, passive trinket. Okay, this is the real Sea Star. It's just a passive trinket where you equip it. Your spells have a chance to grant you intellect. So if you're in a case where, these kind of on-use trinkets that have these kind of notable downsides don't make sense, you can just rock Pips and Sea Star, and you're good to go. That's your kind of rating setup. Inside of dungeons, a lot of the same stuff holds the same thing. Where we'll make changes is I kind of just remove Balefire. It's worse in dungeons generally. In addition to removing Balefire, I did add 2 other ones here. One is Augury of the Primal Flame. It's a really kind of unique-ish AoE trinket, although, it is kind of weird for us to use, and I think a lot of people will prefer it more than we will. So it might be hard to get it inside of raiding. But if you do get it, I think you can see pretty good results inside of Mythic Plus specifically, less so in Raid. It's actually pretty decent. And the last one to think about is Time Thief's Gambit from the Mega Dungeon. It is kind of volatile. It is something you can use every minute, which works really well whenever you're using Dark Ascension builds, specifically. Less good for Void Form. But the kind of trick is it's an on-use static haste trinket, and if you don't, kill any mobs, you actually get stunned 2 minutes later. So the trick here is you just have to keep killing mobs to make sure that doesn't happen. It is kind of buggy to where it says it's actually supposed to remove the paradox when you kill a major enemy. That's not currently working as expected all the time. Especially in dungeons, like a dungeon boss isn't clearing it out. If they fix that, I think it's going to be really fun to use for anyone using Dark Ascension. So definitely something to kind of play around if you get it. The other thing I want to note is time walking trinkets. So interestingly enough, with how we've scaled and just how things have scaled up, these 476 time walking trinkets are actually pretty dang competitive, especially if you're struggling to get any of these guys at a high item level. So when time walking rolls around, particularly Ulduar time walking, although there is one good one for Firelands, like I said, there are 4 competitive trinkets that come out of this. That are just really strong. They're not best in slot, so you don't have to worry if you don't get them. But if you're struggling to get good trinkets, try out time walking. Okay, the next thing to cover is weapons. So with the new patch, we actually have 3 kind of unique cantrip weapons as a Shadow Priest that you can use. One of them is Vikash. This is dropped from the last boss of the raid, so it might be hard to get. This is our kind of best in slot. It is a one-hander, so it is kind of contingent on you getting a competitive high item level offhand, although there are actually like 3 or 4 good offhands from Raid and Mythic Plus, so it shouldn't be too bad to get. So this is going to be your top option if you can get it, especially with a good offhand. Next up is Iridol, the Earthmaster from the Mega Dungeon. This guy can sim at kind of a wide range, specifically because as you're dealing damage to enemies below 35% health, you reduce the cooldown of this. So depending on how much you're fighting things in execute, you'll get more value out of this. Like on a 5-minute like fixed environment, if you get lucky, you can get 2 uses of it in that 5-minute window. Although again, really depends on the situation with the fight. Typically things are dying faster in execute, so even that isn't super reliable. But this is more or less your kind of second best option, and it is a 2-hander, so a bit more accessible in that sense. And you see it's just slightly behind Vikash in kind of an ideal scenario. And then third up is Dreambinder, Loom of the Great Cycle. Again, another 2-hander with great stats on this guy. Just freaking perfect for Shadow Priest. It's an on-use guy that scales in AoE. So this might be like the preferred option for folks inside of dungeons. But again, Iridol, you get more uses of it because you're fighting more things in execute naturally. So I think they both have pretty compelling use cases in all environments. It is slightly behind Iridol, again, but it is more consistent and the stats are a little bit better. And it comes from Raid, a bit more accessible. But it's kind of clearly our third best in kind of a full best in slot environment. So yeah, in kind of a cantrip order, Vikash, then Iridol, then Dreambinder. And these are kind of your rough DPS loss when comparing against this kind of top option. So hopefully this is helpful. And you can see compared to just straight up regular weapons, kind of where things are at. So they're all, considerably ahead of kind of what you would get otherwise. So definitely something to think about. And I put a couple different eye levels for all these guys on there just to kind of show you how things work out. Obviously, this is not showing every combination in the world. Be sure to sim your character. But this is just kind of meant to give you kind of a rough idea of how things look, so you know kind of what to target. One thing to note because of this, I would generally advise against crafting a one-hander or an offhand. Mostly the one-hander here, this patch. They did lower the item level of crafted gear down to 486. Ignore the parentheses here. Those are wrong. It is 486. These numbers. Do take that into account. I know it's confusing. It'll be fixed before the guide gets published. But because it's only 486, it is just you're losing item level on weapon is never a good thing because we want the kind of main stat scaling with that. So yeah, I would generally avoid crafting weapons this season. If you get a Vikash early on, but you're just starved for an offhand, maybe then craft an offhand. Probably like a third or fourth craft. Nothing I would do super early on. So that is weapons. Okay, the final thing I'm going to cover in this video is our tier set bonus. So if you haven't already seen it, let's kind of go over these guys briefly, what you'll get in this season. So our 2-piece is Shadow or Death triggers 2 additional times at 15% effectiveness, and then 1 additional time on top of that if Death Speaker is active or your target is below the execute percent threshold of 20%. So you always get every Shadow or Death will cast 2 echoes, and then if it's in execute or Death Speaker, you'll get 3 echoes total. And the cool part is this works with things like Inescapable Torment. So it all kind of stacks together, although Inescapable Torment is also done at reduced effectiveness. So the majority of our power is inside the 2-piece. You want to get this guy as soon as possible. And then our 4th set is every time you take damage from Shadow or Death, you gain a stack of Death's Torment, increasing the initial damage of your next Shadow or Pain or the damage of your next Shadow Crash. And this stacks up to 12 times. So it is something you kind of want to loosely be keeping track of to make sure that you're not wasting stacks of this. On pure single target, we always use Shadow or Pain to expunge our stacks. And then on anything above single target, you want to prefer to use it on Shadow Crash. And we will always take Shadow Crash above 1 target. Now, that being said, it's going to be quite common for people to run Shadow Crash inside of raiding environments because there are ads in the fight. If that is the case, you prefer using stacks on Shadow Crash, even in single target if you've talented into it. But you still don't want to cap. So if you're capping, you still want to use Shadow or Pain. So Shadow or Crash is your number 1. And then if it's not available, then you use Shadow or Pain. While gearing up, you generally speaking want to prefer dropping either the chest or the gloves here. Those are kind of our worst pieces. It's pretty similar though. So the chest is heavy mastery, low verse, and then the gloves are heavy haste, low crit. You can see both of these will work well depending on your gear set. Although your kind of rough priority is legs, head, shoulders, and then you pick whichever one you get. Rough increases for the tier and single target, 7.5% for the 2-piece, and then overall you get for 4 and 2 you get 10.75%. So, and then dungeons, it's 4 and 8%. A little bit less valuable in dungeons. This is pretty ideal, and most of this is coming from the benefit you're getting on single target. In actual like AoE environments, you're getting much less value out of the set. You really need targets to live and stay inside of execute longer to get the most value out of this. So yeah, you're generally going to replace your season 2 tier pretty quickly. I have a rough guide to hopefully help if you like on the icy veins, and hopefully this is helpful. So that is it for our tier bonuses. Okay, I know it was a really long video. I'm exhausted, but hopefully this helps at least start the season out, and hopefully this has been a good video to watch, and you read alongside with the guide as much as possible. Like I said, keep up to date with anything that's changed down below in the description or whatever. And we'll see you back in the next video. Thanks for watching, guys. Appreciate all the support as usual. And yeah, see you next time.